Hello, my name is Deirdre Cross, Assistant Director for Public Programs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program featuring Timothy Todd, author of A Great Moral and Social Force, with Michael Fletcher of ESPN's Undefeated. This program is offered in conjunction with the exhibition Make Good the Promises, Reclaiming Reconstruction and Its Legacies. A Great Moral and Social Force focuses on the community building power of black banks in cities and towns across the U.S. in the decades immediately following Reconstruction. Please join me in a warm welcome for Timothy Todd and Michael Fletcher.
Hey, thank you, Deirdre, and thanks everyone for joining us for what I think is going to be a really fascinating discussion. I've read this book and I learned a slice of history that I had some clue about, but didn't know any of these details. And I'm looking forward to exploring some of these with Mr. Todd. And Tim, thank you for being here. I really appreciate you doing this, and it's an honor for me to talk to you about this.
Well, it's definitely an honor for me to be a part of this program, and I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Sounds good. Let's start here. This is your second book on black banks, you in conjunction with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. What sparked that interest, both on your part and on the bank's part?
So I'll start from the bank's perspective, and their perspective is obviously central bank of the United States, concerned about economic opportunity, accessibility to credit, folks being able to borrow money on appropriate terms, right? And so there's a lot of issues there, particularly within minority communities, within the Black community. There's been a declining number of Black-owned banks in the United States that's going on for decades now. And those banks are very important in providing credit to their communities, access to financial services. And so obviously there's some concern from the feds in there. Also, you talk about things with alternative financial services providers, stuff like that. We can get into that later if you like. My own interest in this really got spurred through some of the other research I was doing. I do historical research here at the Kansas City Fed and have been looking at other topics related to banking history, financial crisis, things like that. And from time to time, I would come over a small newspaper snippet and it would mention a Black owned bank and it would tell a little bit of a story about it. And I just wanted to know more. It was interesting to me. And I guess I was naive in that I went on, to the web and started looking for a book that I was going to order and read and learn the history. And I realized right away there wasn't a book. And so that really sort of spurred us on. And, it's sort of that thing. If you're a writer and you're interested in reading a book and that book's not written, there's a good chance other people would be interested in reading that book and you should write that book. And so that's what we embarked on. The first book we published in 2019 called Let Us Put Our Money Together, focused primarily on the first three Black-owned banks in the United States, and really got a strong response from a lot of people who wanted us to continue to pursue that history and bring it up to the modern day. And so that's what we've done with a great moral and social force, is we've brought that history forward now, trying to explain banks and communities that were very vibrant, that the banks were very much the heart of economically, and also in community leadership, and really show people there is this rich history.
Yeah. What prompted the formation of the first Black banks, and where did they find capital in those days?
The first one to get chartered was actually in Richmond, Virginia, and it belonged to a fraternal organization called the True Reformers. And the True Reformers were basically a rudimentary type of insurance provider where folks would put their money into the treasury, and then the group would allow members or allocate funds to members based on sickness or a death in the family. And that organization had some difficulty. Its local chapters, one of the chapters, had some difficulty finding a place to store its money. And so they reached out to the headquarters, and the folks at the headquarters there were some individuals there who had thought about creating a bank before, and they saw this as an opportunity to create that bank, that they could take the money from the local chapters and create that bank. And so that's what they did. Other banks came about in a little different fashion, a bank in Washington, D.C., a bank in Birmingham, Alabama. But all of these were very much community initiatives where the community deposited its money, and then that money could foster economic opportunity. That's really the very basic business of banking, taking those financial resources and making them available to everyone.
What, and the way you describe this, so are Black banks any different than other community banks in kind of their origins, and A, and B, were their missions in any way different as far as you could see it?
So the earliest banks, it's really interesting when you go back and study the history, and as we write about, in a great moral and social force, when we look at places like Memphis in the civil rights era, Detroit, rural Oklahoma, and places like that, Chicago on the south side, you see time and again that these banks, the bankers go in and create these institutions. No one's really sitting back and saying, here's a financial opportunity and how I can make some money. It's about, how do we serve the community? How can we create opportunity? How can I be a community leadership? What's in the community's best interest? And so I think that's a little bit unique. I mean, obviously there's a lot of community bankers of all types even today who feel that way, but I think it might surprise people to see the community engagement that was going on with many of these institutions. And another thing I might add, particularly on the earliest banks, they were exceptionally well run for the time that they did business. So if you know much about U.S. financial history, in the late 1800s, we are basically in a decades-long financial crisis that just continues to evolve. A typical bank lasted about 6 or 7 years, or a bank of the size that the black banks were at that time. And the first three black banks averaged about a 20-year lifespan. It's pretty impressive. They remained really stable at a time of widespread financial instability.
Given that instability, how did they attract depositors? I think I would have kept my money under my mattress.
Right. So yeah, there's sort of a joke, and actually one of the lines in the book is, in those days you create a bank just by painting the word bank on the window, and people could give you their money or not on deposit. But one of the things they did to attract depositors is they worked very closely with depositors. So if you look at some of the earliest black banks in Richmond, I think they ended up having about five at one point, and they did things like operated outside of normal business hours to serve the community, recognizing that their customers couldn't get there during bankers' hours. But they also had a lot of programs where a bank, Nickel Savings Bank, gave its customers these little nickel plated banks that they could put their nickels in. And every 3 months, you could bring a bank into Nickel Savings Bank and you would make a deposit that way. So these were small dollar deposits, very much so. But it was the idea of beginning a banking relationship and helping people begin to save that money. So they did a lot of things like that. It wasn't about, getting that big deposit right away. It was about sort of building a community, and the people in the community recognized and responded to that.
So you're saying that you felt like the depositors kind of shared a mission in a way, like they wanted to help build an institution, or were they just customers, looking for.
Right. Well, yeah, I think so. And also recognize, for a good portion of this history, you've got a segregated economy. And
Yeah.
so, to go back to Richmond, you look at Richmond at that time, you have the growth of the Jackson Ward neighborhood, a very dynamic neighborhood that had all sorts of activities and businesses. If you go, the beginning of the Great Migration and to the shortly after the World War I period, you see the development of the South Side of Chicago, very dynamic neighborhood developing there, and banks are very much a part of that, very much engaged in that process, providing the money that's helping people buy homes and start businesses and sort of keep that economy running.
I was so fascinated by kind of the cast of characters that you sort of introduced us to through the book, and kind of the different kinds of communities that supported banks. You had Richmond, as you mentioned, Chicago, Detroit, Memphis, my favorite, Boley, Oklahoma. How how did you decide on, to focus on those places, and why?
So what we wanted to do is, people told us they wanted more of that history. And so we wanted to come up with a way that kept the story accessible to people who, you didn't have to be a banker, you didn't have to be someone with a finance degree to follow the story. And so what we tried to do was go out and move forward through history, starting there in Richmond after the failure of Reconstruction, and then move forward in history looking at key communities at their sort of formative time, or when they were the most noteworthy. So after Richmond, then you go to Oklahoma. And what happened in Oklahoma and in other plain states, Kansas, to a lesser degree, Nebraska, somewhat on the plains of Colorado, is you had individuals and families who, after the war, and particularly after the failure of Reconstruction, wanted to get out of the South. And so some headed north, but others headed west. And Oklahoma was there, and the land was available. And so you had eventually about 50 all Black communities created in Oklahoma. And Boley, Oklahoma was sort of the star of the show. It was one of the first that was formed. It ended up having three banks there. It was a very vibrant community that served that area. It's about equidistant between Oklahoma City and Tulsa. Served a large population of primarily farmers in that area, and was a very vibrant community. The National Negro Business League leadership came there twice and held events there. It's a very small town today, but during its heyday, it was quite the place and received a lot of national attention.
Really interesting. Just so people listening could understand this, when was the first Black bank formed? The one in Richmond. What year was that?
So right, so those are formed in the late 1800s. So around 1889 is when you see those banks form. But there were actually discussions about creating a Black bank going. We were able to trace that as far back as 1851, I think. And there were some meetings
Right.
in New York City, where there were some people in the North who wanted to create a Black-owned bank, feeling that one, it would help people save money and do all those things like start businesses, right? But it would also be a very strong symbolic symbol too. And so there was some interest in doing that, but many of the individuals who were at that meeting and had that discussion were involved in so many other things, trying to obtain or trying to achieve emancipation and the abolition of slavery. And so for many of them were key figures on the Underground Railroad and in publishing, things like that. And so there was really no one who could sort of take that mantle and make that happen. And so it's after the failure of Reconstruction then where you begin to see rights being further curtailed in the South, and you have the beginning, the rise of more frequent racial violence in the South. That's when you begin to see the banks form because the segregation begins to become more prominent and more dangerous. And I think we should be, it's important to note that throughout history, many of these individuals involved at these banks did so at significant personal risk to their safety. You know, we mentioned Chicago, and you look at Jesse Binga on the south side of Chicago. His home was firebombed, what I think 5 times. And so there was a lot of risk involved too. So, you know, you're a banker, you're helping people obtain opportunity, you have a high public profile, and in some parts of the country, it's a very volatile environment.
Mhm. You know, before reading this book, I think I might have said that the first black bank I thought was a black bank was Freedman's Bank. Tell us that story.
Right. So Freedman's Bank, and so it's interesting. I go to conferences and people say, you know, I know the first black bank, it was Freedman's Bank. And so what Freedman's Bank is it was a bank that the government created that opened branches across the South where formerly enslaved individuals could deposit their funds. It became sort of known as a black bank, but it was not a black bank. It was established by the government, and its leadership were actually individuals, white individuals who were significantly engaged on Wall Street. And so the bank, it did provide people a place to save their money, but it wasn't doing things like lending back to the community, right? That key function if we're going to talk about economic opportunity. And so what ends up happening is it ends up failing in the 1870s as amid a financial crisis, and it wipes the depositors out. And so there were about 60,000 depositors. The most any of them got was 60 cents on the dollar after a process that lingers for years. So many of them got 30 cents or less. A lot of them got nothing. Now, remember, we're talking about, you know, people where you know, as an enslaved individual, maybe you've had the opportunity to hire some of your time out on your own. So, you know, you might have $1 literally to your name that's in that account. That's everything you have in the world, and that's lost. And so there has been, you know, any number of folks look at that and say, well, that was really, you know, that was a black bank. At the time, it was viewed somewhat as a black bank failure, obviously incorrectly. They brought in Frederick Douglass to try and save it at the 11th hour, which, you know, he thought it was a great opportunity till he opened up the bank books and realized it was going to be a disaster, and that failure had already been determined. And so, but a lot of people look at that and say, well, there's a distrust in the black community of financial services providers, and it starts with the Freedmen's Bank. And so one of the things we've tried to do with our research is say, hold on, there is a rich and vibrant history that went on for years and years and years in many communities across the United States. And that's just not the case. And that these banks were successful. They helped create successful communities.
You've been at this research now for a number of years, I'm sure. Tell me, as you kind of look over the span of your work, what's kind of been the greatest insight that you've developed, you think?
I think one of the things is if you look back historically, obviously my research focuses on banking and sort of understanding the roots of banking and community banking at a real basic level. So if you look at the history of banking in Europe, for example, it's primarily early on the purview of the very wealthy and governments, established industries. In the United States, banks of all types developed really out of a need to sort of help the community. So it was small depositors who came together to try and help each other. The black banks really illustrate that point very clearly, but it's a sort of need for access to credit. Whereas in Europe, you had wealthy private banks where people had excess funds. So they had the wealth and they wanted to put that money to work. In the United States, it's about creating that opportunity. It's a fundamental difference, and it's one of the reasons why we have a lot of small banks in the United States today, whereas other countries have only, even Canada, have only a few very large banks.
Interesting. Anything surprise you in this research? Did you walk away thinking, "Wow, I didn't know that," or I wouldn't have guessed that"?
You know, I I think I've been at this long enough that I don't know that I get real surprised,
Yeah.
but I think something that will surprise people who read the book is when I talk with groups, I think there's this vision people sort of carry in their mind. If you say a banker, they sort of think of the little guy from Monopoly, with his top hat and his monocle or whatever. Right, exactly. But that's but that's not what happens here. And what you see, and I think the thing in the book that really comes through is you see time and again these bankers at the forefront of some very important civil rights issues in U.S. history. You see that happening in Memphis, where Jesse Turner there is a bank official, and he's involved in a couple key civil rights lawsuits. The bank in Memphis also during an economic freeze, where white supremacists in Mississippi had cut individuals and families off from their banks and basically called in their loans and were attempting to wipe them out financially. Tri-State Bank in Memphis goes down there and organizes an effort to try and help people financially. So when you see those types of historic events and you see those things happen, even in Boley, Oklahoma, Muhammad Ali talked about going there and having a fight at one point, but they weren't able to quite work it out on how that would happen outdoors. But it's interesting to see how many touch points there are in banking history with very prominent individuals and events throughout United States history. And I think that's something that may surprise some people.
It's interesting. You mentioned this tradition of community banks in the United States, and I remember being surprised when I learned that the Bank of America started as the Bank of Italy in San Francisco, essentially a community bank, and it grew into this colossus. Have any Black banks come close to kind of like that kind of what I'll call here crossover success?
So they have not obviously achieved that sort of broad
Yeah,
scale.
obviously
There
not the
Right, but there have been
scale.
had some who had visions of that, and for one reason or another, it didn't quite work out. I'm certainly not the first to observe that times of economic difficulty hit the Black community particularly hard, and at times where banks have started to gain some traction, and there's been a financial crisis, the number of Black-owned banks in the United States has trended downward, sometimes very sharply. But there is an issue, and it's talked about in the book, and people talk about it today. Is how do you serve a community? Is a Black bank? How do you bring dollars into the community? How can you attract white depositors or depositors from elsewhere to give you those funds to lend out in the community? So that's obviously an issue and something I think people keep in mind, but it's not something that I don't know anyone's been able to achieve.
Now you mentioned that, and another. So many things surprised me, at least in this book. I read about the Binga Bank in Chicago, and you, if I'm not mistaken, said that he had a fair number of white customers, white depositors, putting
Yeah.
their money into a Black bank. How did he pull that off?
So Jesse Binga is a really interesting individual. So he had come to Chicago around the time of the 1893 World's Fair and worked very hard and sort of worked his way up to become a self-made man. His family had been in the real estate business in Detroit, and he had learned from his family how to manage real estate. So he could go in, and if something broke, he could fix it. And so started getting involved after he had done a number of jobs, got involved in real estate. And through that, as he began to expand his holdings, a number of white property owners would hire him to work on their properties and eventually serve as a property manager. And so a lot of the buildings on the south side of Chicago, now this is pre the migration, pre World War I. And so a lot of buildings along South State there on the south side of Chicago were white owned, white businesses. When Jesse Binga expands out of his real estate business into banking, he goes into a building that had actually been a white owned bank. So by that time, he is, thoroughly entrenched in the community, both the Black and the white community. He's well known. He's well respected for the work he's done, and he's a local bank there in the community for what's then a white or a more white South Side than what it would become. And so that's how he was able to do that. And over time, that's going to change, and racial tensions will rise with the Great Migration, and then particularly after the war. Then when you begin to see people competing for jobs, you begin to see that this Black community that had been created on the South Side It's not large enough to hold the number of individuals and families are coming. They begin to expand and buy houses in neighboring communities, and then that's when you really start to see all that tension rise. But it was a little bit of a different environment back in 1908 when Jesse got started in banking.
And yet another surprising fact, at least to me, was that Black Wall Street, we call it Black Wall Street, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, this thriving Black, really Main Street in Oklahoma, had no Black bank.
Right.
Why is that?
So when we did the research, and I had known, living in the central United States, I'd been a little bit aware of Foley. I'd been aware of other all Black towns, and Nicodemus, Kansas, for example, was well known in the area where I happened to grow up. And so I thought that, after I learned about those communities and I was getting ready to look at Tulsa, I fully expected that I was going to find all sorts of Black banks there, and that wasn't the case. And it surprised me. And I actually, this was during COVID, and so some people in Tulsa, historical society there, went over the real estate books and the business licenses and everything, cross-checked addresses, and found out no, in fact, there was not a bank there. And I think there's a few reasons for that. If you remember, I said earlier, banks generally develop in a time where people don't have access to significant amounts of money. And so recognize, one, that Tulsa had a booming oil economy where everyone was comparatively well paid. So you didn't have that sort of lack of economic opportunity. And then you had the founders of that area, a gentleman named O.W. Gurley and a gentleman named J.B. Stratford, who really acquired a lot of that real estate and developed that community. They were wealthy and they did a lot of private financing. So they would finance people to buy their homes. And so you had a number of other private lenders develop there as well. Now, not all of them were probably, scrupulous, right? Like any neighborhood, there were probably all different types of them. But it appears that Stratford and Gurley and many others were, scrupulous lenders. Some of them had relationships with banks there in Tulsa. And so that's really how that community develops. It's interesting then that after the tragedy there in 1921, there's a national, fundraising effort like we often have today, where I guess people go to GoFundMe now to send that money. But people actually sent that money to the bank in Boley, and it actually administered those funds to people. And so it's interesting that this bank in a small town, an hour's drive away, was really sort of helping to serve that community at that difficult time.
I was wondering, maybe here you could take a moment to kind of like give people kind of like a little timeline of Black banks. So they start kind of post Reconstruction. There's an increase in the number around the turn of the century, going up towards the 20s, and then you get to the Depression. Just sort of take us forward.
Right. So yeah. So at the time, pre-depression, you are somewhere probably between 60 and 100 banks, Black-owned banks in the United States. Now, recognize that the data is a little sketchy, I guess you would say, or a little hit and miss. And what was defined as a bank could be any number of things, but there were definitely a significant number of Black-owned banks. And then what happens is the Great Depression, and many of these banks are wiped out. I think there's about 8 banks that end up still in business after the Great Depression. And as I mentioned earlier, Black America was hit particularly hard by the Great Depression. And so banks can be a catalyst for a community's uplift, but also they're going to reflect that community. When that community suffers, that bank is going to suffer. And that was the case here. And then you go for quite some time. You go into the mid to late 1940s before you see the effort to create Tri-State, actually, the bank in Memphis. And then there's a bank established actually in Kansas City, Kansas, not far from where I am tonight, that's established shortly after that. And so you begin to see a few banks established. And then as the civil rights era begins to pick up steam, you see more social activism. You see things, the government takes some steps to try and address redlining and some of the other things that have been going on. You begin to see an increase in the number of banks again, and some real spirit behind those banks and some real energy there. And then what begins to happen, of course, then you get to the 1980s and we're sort of repeating the financial crisis thing again. And so then you begin to see a decline. And then in the past 20 years, we've gone from about 50 Black-owned banks in the United States to about 18, I think.
Hello? Oh, okay. Oh, good. Okay. I'm glad it's not me. Okay. Okay. Well, let me stop you real quickly. You talked about the sort of precipitous decline during the Depression, which I think everyone could understand. But why no boom with kind of the World War II boom and the post-war boom when the country was doing so well economically? And obviously, Black Americans didn't share in that completely, but we did somewhat. Why do you think we didn't see kind of a quicker rebound?
Well, I think the lessons uh, of the Depression left a very lasting mark and a very deep impression, particularly in the Black community. And so I think there was, obviously concern about risk. Uh, People were, otherwise occupied, I guess you would say, around the war effort with opportunities they have, and it wasn't something that attracted a lot of interest until you actually get out of the war period, where you start to see that reemergence. But it was obviously the Depression had been a very difficult time, and it really left a deep mark.
And what about some of the programs we saw kind of rise during probably the late 60s, early 70s? We had government initiatives, government deposits required or at least encouraged into Black banks. What were some of the shortcomings of those ideas, and why didn't they do more to kind of lift the fortunes of Black banks, in your opinion?
Yeah, so there was a lot of interest in well, from the non-government side. Is we've seen here in the last year or two, you've seen some major corporations put money in Black-owned banks. They've received some press for that. You had something similar to that actually happen in the 1960s on a little bit of a smaller scale. And then around that same time, you had a government-initiated program that would encourage government deposits of all types to be sent to Black-owned banks. And it I think the results were at best mixed. Some banks, the deposits came, for example, from the post office, and so those post office accounts balances would fluctuate a lot. So it was very costly to manage those funds. Those were expensive dollars to be able for the bank to have on deposit. So there were issues like that. There were also limits, and there were some requirements on they had to hold certain securities depending on how much money they had on the government accounts. Some banks were able to get some benefit out of them, but I think overall the program never really lived up to the hopes of the people who put it out there. There's still a program out there today, but I don't know that the opinions have changed much about it. I could be wrong about that, but I don't know.
You mentioned in the book, you mentioned a report by Arthur Burma back, I think, in 1970, when he was, I think, the first African American on the Federal Reserve, right? If I have that right. And he obviously economist and esteemed researcher. And one of the things he mentioned was, and I think it was taken, as you pointed out, I think it was a little bit taken out of context, but he said at the time in 1970 that Black banks tended to be less profitable and less efficient than similarly sized community banks. Uh, Talk about kind of the impact of that kind of observation, and what he really meant, and what kind of how that reverberated.
Right. So a lot of people reacted very angrily to that. Understandably, many Black bankers, many civic leaders were very upset when he said that. The point he was trying to make was, as we look uh, at the landscape very broadly, these are small banks. They can make a difference in a community. But what he was wanting is he was wanting to come up with a way, or to draw attention to the idea that the very largest banks needed to be doing more in minority communities, and that if we're going to achieve broad scale economic improvement for a large number of individuals, it's going to take a big bank to do that, or multiple big banks to do that. That's what he was trying to say. But it sort of got misconstrued a little bit. He did come back, I think, a year later and sort of clean it up a little bit, and explain a little more of what he meant, and that he was very much an advocate for the Black-owned banks. But even today, the Black-owned banks are smaller institutions. They're community-sized institutions. So they're still small banks, but they're still making a big difference in the communities where they're doing business.
Mhm. You mentioned that you kind of, when you were going through the timeline, took us up to the turn of the 21st century. I think there was something like 48 Black banks back in 2000, 2001. Now we're down to, I think the number is 18. What's happened in the last 20, 22 years?
So you have seen a decline in the number of community banks overall in the United States. You've seen more people moving to the big banks, those really big banks that everybody knows their names, and you see them in every community across the United States. The decline in the number of Black-owned banks has been more severe than what we've seen overall in the banking sector. And we've also seen other types of minority-owned depository institutions. So Hispanic American banks, Native American banks, Asian American banks, their numbers have shown a little bit of improvement, in some cases, significant improvement over that period. So that's obviously troubling. Again, we know that the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, the housing bubble, hit Black homeowners very, very hard. There is some research out there that has suggested that some of these individuals who got sort of caught up in no interest or low interest loans that then, adjustable rate mortgage that reset on them, they were victimized, and they may have been um, caught unaware because they had not had a bank in their community and had not developed a banking relationship. They'd been dealing with an alternative financial services provider for so long, a payday lender, let's say, or a title loan place. And so that sort of left them with a misinterpretation of what was a good deal or what's an appropriate level of interest in financing.
Mhm. Now, you mentioned that the people kind of using these alternative financial institutions. You look at the numbers. What is it? Brookings Institution says 14% of Black households or Black individuals, can't remember which, are unbanked, meaning no bank account. Another 32% are underbanked, meaning they may have a bank account, but they don't use it for everything. They will go to the check cash and house, or to the title loan place and so forth. Um, it feels like a big business opportunity. Why, is it just a lack of scale? Why is it that Black banks are unable to fill that void?
So, well, one thing I will say about alternative financial services providers is they can be horribly damaging to an individual, and they are located predominantly in minority communities, and there's been a lot of research out there. When Black owned banks close, we know that it's unlikely that another bank is going to move into that community, that it's probably going to be an alternative financial services provider who was either already there, is going to expand their footprint, or they're going to move into that community. So that's really troubling. I think, yeah, there's an opportunity there, but I think also it's a little bit of a difficult environment to be a small banker, right? To go out and start a small bank in the current competitive landscape. One of the real strengths of a community banker is that they like to lend, or have the ability to lend traditionally on soft information about an individual's character and the way they pay their bills and do things like that. And some of that can be very hard to quantify under the type of metrics that a regulator is going to look at. And so there's obviously some challenges there that all banks face. And so as you look at a community, that there may be an opportunity there, but it's probably going to take some time to develop that.
Mhm. I just want to take a second to ask any viewers who have questions to, you know, send them in. How do you send them in, Deirdre? Through, I guess, into the live chat, and I will pose them to Mr. Todd. Um, just real quickly though, just to sort of stay on this point, uh, how much do you think Black banks have been affected by, kind of, if you will, the dispersal of the African American community? Like, many of the banks have locations in kind of what we'd call traditional Black communities. I grew up in New York City. Bedford Stuyvesant isn't what it was when I was a kid. Harlem's not what it was when I was a kid. It's become the racial mix is different. More African Americans have moved out to Long Island and to different parts of Queens, and you see that in city after city, kind of the suburbanization of kind of the Black population. Is that a factor you think that would have the banks been able to follow the population or follow the money, so to speak?
So obviously that's is factoring in communities as well. The even with as much as you can do online today, or over your phone, bank proximity continues to be a big factor when people decide to open a bank account. And so that place you go by on the evening commute is pretty good chance that's going to be where you're going to do your banking business. And so if the bank that's in that community, the bank that's on the corner near your place, that's probably where you're going to do business. And so obviously, can be a little bit of a challenge.
You mentioned kind of online banking. As I think about my own banking habits, I say, gosh, I don't exactly remember the last time I walked physically inside a bank. I bought a car less than a year ago, and I did everything. I did the application online. They FedEx the check to my home. I took the check to the car dealer. I did it that way actually through my credit union. But it's it feels like a new world. Like I don't like you talk about soft information. There's a bank in a shopping center up the street from me. They don't know me from Adam, um, and they don't know, no one could vouch for me there. How have black banks been affected by kind of this online revolution, if you will?
So yeah, I was reading a report just before we started this evening that was talking about the Black community is responding well to online banking and online financial services providers. That there's been significant adoption. I haven't really had a chance to look through the data to see what that says. Obviously, I think there's some definite opportunities with online and application based banking, but I continue to kind of fall back to, I like that idea of having a presence in the community where you've got like a brick and mortar structure. And a lot of it's because of the reasons that we talk about in the book. When you sort of look back historically, that these banks were financial services providers, but the bankers were key individuals. So, you look back at, the South Side of Chicago in 1919, the city's erupting in violence, and Jesse Benga arranges to have trucks deliver food and water to the south side of the community when people can't get out to get their own food and water. And you look at what happened in Memphis around the civil rights era, that the bank is there, it's helping post bail money to get people who have been arrested while they're out protesting, and that there's meetings to plan the next civil disturbance or civil action that's going on at the bank headquarters, that they're having it there in the bank meeting room. I think there's a lot of value in those things too, and sort of, how does that all work together? I'm not quite sure. I think the technology provides an opportunity, but I think it's about more than just the business of banking.
Mhm. It's funny because you keep coming back to this theme, and which is to me such a fascinating thread that runs through the book, kind of the social kind of role that these bankers and these banks play, just so far removed from the image of the monopoly man and in the top hat. But and that's a great thing, but has it also been maybe a burden in the sense that, a banker, in the same way a teacher would say, I just want to teach math and reading. I don't want to have to worry about doing all of this other stuff about people's lives. Like a banker I should be focused on maybe being a greedy banker. Maybe greedy is not the right word, but you know what I mean? Just a profit making
Right.
banker. To what degree do you think this kind of extra burden that they carry has
So,
affected
so,
their forces?
so I'm going to flip it around on you a little bit.
Okay.
And say, so one of the things that I think that all of us in the Federal Reserve, anybody in financial services, people in education need to work on is, first of all, getting more minorities involved in the banking profession. But I also think that the banking profession needs to look for people of any race who are motivated by a sense of community spirit and community leadership and community engagement, and then teach those people the financial side of the business. So, look at the people who are doing, engaged in volunteer work, or they're doing a lot of charitable work. Can we bring those people into banking and sort of teach them the business side of the business, recognizing that, they may be the people who can find those important opportunities and will have a personal motivation to sort of make some of those things happen. So that's kind of how I think about the problem you were referencing there.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to turn to a few of the questions that have come in, at least for now. One, this is an interesting one because you mentioned it in the book a little bit. Talk a little bit about the relationship between some of the insurance companies we saw, some of these Black insurance companies back through time, such as the Southern Aid Society, someone mentions here, and kind of their connection to Black banks.
Yeah, so there is some history there of a connection with insurance companies and the work that they did, and there's individuals who operated both, who maybe came up through the insurance side. So you see some of that in Tennessee. You saw some of that in Memphis, where individuals who had come up from the insurance business then moved into banking, and so you saw businesses offering sort of both of those products. So there is definitely a relationship there, as there are with other types of, financial institutions, especially when you were in that earlier era. You would see people involved in all sorts of different, insurance or real estate or other type things that were a part of their banking business, of that business model.
Mhm. And someone else asked, let's see, where should we go here? Someone was curious about the Victory Savings Bank. This is a pop quiz now. The
Okay.
Victory Savings Bank in Columbia, South Carolina. It survived a depression. What's become of the bank, and what can you say about the history?
So I am not 100% up to speed on it. I
Okay.
think it got acquired, but I don't want to tell a
Okay.
story and be wrong about
Okay. No problem. No way I could have prepared for that one, but I
it.
just go in here. Let's see. And what about the Federal Reserve through the years and the different the state chartering agencies? What role have they played with black banks through the years? Have they been a hindrance? Have they been helpful? Has it been a mix?
Well, it's hard for me to say from the Federal Reserve's perspective. I think bankers would probably have some view on that. And they would obviously, and it's some of the same types of challenges that I mentioned earlier that banks face right now, as far as the cost of doing business as a small banker, and what types of things, how do you want to be able to lend money, and what are the regulations allow you to do as far as being able to lend money. So it's a lot of those same things. I mean, I don't pretend that all of us can't do a lot more than we've been doing. I mean, we can all do more. Everybody who's involved in it, that's what it's going to take. And if it's banks and communities, if it's online banking, it's got to be a multi-part effort. When one of the things, and we don't pretend to have all the answers. We're telling this history. One reason is to sort of get this dialogue going, and get a lot more people in the discussion and bring some attention to it. And one of the things that's clear is, yes, a bank can make a difference in any number of lives in a community. If you're uplifting one life, if you're helping people, and sometimes I get very much caught up in the, start a business or buy a home. But I mean, there's also, pay for a new refrigerator, allow me to get this molar fixed that's been bothering me for 5 years, or, whatever, right? I mean, a lot of it's that type of stuff too, just very much sort of day to day. And so it's got to be a broad-based effort that everyone needs to get behind. You can make a difference in communities one person at a time, and that's important. But what can be the next thing? What more can be done?
Mhm. Talk a bit about your sort of research methods. Did you have an opportunity to visit many black banks? How did you unearth some of this history and
Yeah. So we did most of this work. I started on this work. I'd actually been, the book begins actually with me telling an anecdote about being in Richmond, Virginia. That was the last trip that I went on pre-COVID. So I took the train to Washington, D.C. I flew back to Kansas City, and the country was basically locked down a week later. And so we did this whole book, for me, basically in my home office. There are a lot of resources that you can find. Fortunately, you have some of the most renowned and important black newspapers, Chicago Defender. You can go out online if you have a good local library. Even you can get access to a lot of these things. Organizations like the True Reformers would publish, a 25th anniversary retrospective that would have all sorts of bios. So, I sometimes say that I don't think the history of black banks was forgotten as much as it was just sort of scattered about. And somebody needed to go out there and pick up these pieces and start figuring out, how can we put these things together and try to tell a succinct type of story. So that's a lot of what we did. And then also, like the situation in Tulsa, just calling people who worked at local historical societies and saying, hey, can you, help me with this? Or calling the folks at the Maggie Walker National Historic Society in Richmond, asking them, hey, can you guys send us some photos, or can you help us with that? So those types of things were helpful as well.
Mhm. Yeah, you mentioned Tulsa again. Did Tulsa eventually develop a black-owned bank? I see in one of these questions here that may have been the case. And if so, do you know anything about it?
I do not believe they do not currently have a black owned bank in Tulsa. Now recognize that There's another type of institution called a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institutions.
Yeah.
And CDFIs are not banks. They do lend money, but they can lend, without getting into a long discussion here, basically most CDFIs or many CDFIs get their money from private sources. So like a charity or an individual might put some money there, and then the lending decisions are based on whatever criteria that wants to go on, that the person who provides the money wants to overlay on that. And so sometimes you'll see people refer to a CDFI or other types of financial organization as a bank when it's technically not a bank and that it's not taking deposits.
Mhm. You mentioned the pandemic. What impact has the pandemic had on the handful of remaining black banks? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I think the pandemic, has had a significant toll on the Black community, and so that's going to be, reflected on the pressures, on the issues that the banks face. As I said, banks can uplift a community, can do a lot for a community, but at the end of the day, they're probably going to reflect that community also. When the community suffers, it's going to get more challenging for them.
Mhm. In the book, and I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the bank in Memphis. I think there was a effort at one point to sort of have almost a national call for deposits. Um, those kinds of things. Talk about how successful they've been, what their limitations are. Because you hear that all the time. You hear that connected to black business, sort of, writ large. Like, people need to buy black and give money to turn over. What was the figure in Bowley? Like the dollar turned over
Right. Turns out, yeah, how many
26
ever come
times or some
right
incredible
right before it
number.
goes out? Yeah.
Yeah. How successful have those kind of campaigns been to say, well, black people deposit money in a black bank, you're helping your community by doing that. And if they haven't been so successful, what do you think are what's stopping that from occurring?
So I think the success has probably been mixed on those. So some banks, you've seen some of these corporate initiatives recently over the past 2 years probably, and some banks have received significant funds from those. Others not so much. Banks want to be able to lend money, so there's that part of it also is finding being able to work within a regulatory landscape to be able to lend that money can be a challenge in some instances, and so it's sort of all sort of part of uh, that relationship. I mean, there's different.
Very real quickly, you say, being able to lend money. Is it more difficult, and just so people understand, for a community bank to say, I don't want to say take, I guess all lending is a risk, take sort of a risk, let's say, on a borrower or my business idea. Is it harder for a community bank to do that than, say, one of the mega banks? And if so, why?
So I wouldn't say it is harder. What I would say is that if you are at a community bank, if we have a community bank and we are in this neighborhood and someone comes and they want to build a grocery store on the corner, and we all know this neighborhood needs a grocery store, and the person who's come to us asking for this loan, they're just a great guy. They've done all these things, whatever. From a regulatory standpoint, trying to fit those sort of unquantifiable qualities within a metric that's going to meet a regulatory review standard can be a challenge. And so that type of lending was that was the bread and butter for community banks for a long time. And it can be difficult now for them to be able to do that. And so you think about, community banks are key lenders for small businesses in particular, community banks of all type here, especially minority communities and mortgage lenders. They're key lenders to borrowers who are in just those types of situations where that what we call soft information, can make a big difference. And so that's sort of the challenge there. It's not, I wouldn't say it's easier or harder. I think a community banker will tell you they might give more weight to that soft information than maybe a bank that's not a local bank.
Mhm. You mentioned mortgages, and clearly, many black banks, that was kind of the bread and butter early on. But if I read the papers correctly, what is it now that most mortgage lending is done through non-bank entities like the Rocket Mortgages of the world? And if it's not most, it's clearly a larger slice.
Right.
And how has that, again, sort of impacted the fortunes of?
Well, it's
But
it's another opportunity, and it's another, I think what most people would judge a relatively safe opportunity, and it's also one that's, really, really important to, if we're going to improve a community. If you're in a low to moderate income community and you want uh, property values to rise, you want people to be able to buy homes and not just buy them. You want to be able to improve them and add on or renovate or whatever, right? So that can be very important.
what about, we talk a lot in the community sort of perspective. What about the idea of black banks lending to corporate America? Like, I think you mentioned one sort of a group that was put together to lend money to GE and I forget
Right.
the other corporation. Have there been many efforts like that in the past? Because that feels like a good bet. You lend to
Right.
these
No,
Fortune
yeah,
500
you've
companies.
yeah, you've seen some of that
Yeah.
historically where, a big lender like or a big borrower like a GE where one small bank can't fill that demand or wants to be able to bring others in. So yeah, you have seen that happen, and I think those situations have worked fairly well, especially when you're talking about a big, well established firm with a significant national footprint.
Mhm. I have a question here. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts about it. 'Cause I have my thoughts and I'll keep them to myself. But looking to the future, how will cryptocurrency affect black banks, you think?
So one of the things, without getting into the whole crypto discussion, one of the things that I have learned from going out and doing events like this and talking about this book is a lot of people are looking at crypto as sort of a safe place to store their money. And I obviously can't speak on behalf of the Federal Reserve, right? I'm a historian who does historical research, and my opinions are only my own. But I think that's very concerning. When you put money in a bank, you have the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, standing there in back of those deposits, and you put that money in there. And if that bank runs into trouble, in the highly unlikely event that bank runs into trouble, the FDIC is going to take care of you. I don't know how you can feel protected with money if you're putting all your savings in cryptocurrency. But I have learned that its popularity is growing, particularly in the Black community, or at least that's what I've been told in some of the events I've done recently.
Read as much. I think the University of Chicago did a study that I want to say it was University of Chicago that documented that. I don't know quite what they looked at to document it, but that's what I understand, which makes me shudder. I'll leave it there, because it just feels like. I mean, I read a lot about economics. I don't even know. I mean, I know what cryptocurrency is, but I don't quite understand its utility yet. So
Yeah, so I know that the study I read earlier today that talked about the adoption of online banking by Black households tried to suggest that there might be more interest in cryptocurrency because there's a higher comfort level with online financial services access. But I'm not ready to go there
I mean, yeah, to me,
quite
it's a
yet.
big difference between, well, what do you mean, like Zelle or PayPal or
Right,
Venmo? Big
right,
difference between that and crypto, and
right, right.
to my way of thinking.
Yes.
Anyway, and does anyone else have any other questions to send in? Because I think we might be close to wrapping it up here. Really interesting. I just want to encourage everybody to try to read this book. Like, this is such a fascinating slice of history for people like myself. I mean, the older I get, the more I find myself interested in history, and the more you can see your own experiences kind of reflected in history. And I mean, I just want to compliment you, Mr. Todd. What a great work, and
Thank you.
I look forward to your next act.
Thanks.
Maybe we can end there. What's next?
Well, no, we'll see. I do want to let people know that, you go to kansascityfed.org and you can download a copy of this and it's free. You can get the PDF or you can fill out a form and we will put one in the mail to you without charge. So people can learn more about this history for themselves.
I hope
Um,
everyone heard that without charge. So
Without charge. Yeah, I think, the next thing for me is just listening to a lot of what people are saying. That's what really prompted us to do this book, is people wanted to know more of this history. And so for me, I'm just trying to learn and get the message out there, and then we'll see where it leads.
no, again, I mean, like I said, it's fascinating work, and to me, the idea of kind of the social dimension of banking that comes across is a powerful one. It's not one I think most people think of. It's not one I often think of, but it's such a powerful tool,
Yeah,
and we
when
tend
you
to think
put
of bankers as suits and, sort of soulless, and
right.
it's sort
Well,
of just,
when you put your money in a bank, you are in a way creating an economic opportunity for somebody, right? Now, is it somebody in your community? Maybe, maybe not. And so I think, it's important to kind of think about those things. And I think a lot of people haven't thought about banking that way in a long time.
yeah, great. Okay, just want to thank you again. All the best.
Oh, I've loved it. Thank you very much.
Okay.